Welcome to Come to Think of It. My name is Steve Nemirovsky and I'm your host. For some time I've been trying to figure out how to attack the topic of whatever it is that's happening on our college campuses. But if you can't exactly define a problem, it becomes hard to design an interview to examine cause and effect, and most importantly, to talk about solutions. Every time I think I have an approach that makes sense, there's a new series of twists and turns, and for the most part, all negative. A few years ago, just tackling wokeism might have seemed sufficiently topical. Then the death of George Floyd, the resurgence of Black Lives Matter consumed the agenda, only to be superseded by attacks on colonialism and racism and capitalism, or was it the other way around? Following October 7, violent protests and anti-Semitism added another layer of conflict, which has triggered a harsh response from the Trump administration that also includes a long simmering conservative distrust for the proliferation of DEI. To a certain extent, all of the above revolve around issues of free speech on college campuses. That's a topic we examined during an earlier interview with FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights on Expression, which you can find on GrassRoots TV website and on YouTube. And of course, that's all on top of the spiraling cost of education, student loan repayment and forgiveness debates, grade inflation, the impact of AI on teaching and testing, changing demographics, virtual teaching, Supreme Court decisions limiting affirmative action, and a massive reworking of college athletics and payments to athletes. And can we discuss college athletics without mentioning gender changes and the impact on women's sports competition? There's a lot there. While I may not know how to best tackle the discussion, I have at least determined where to start. I stumbled on a very timely book called Whatever It Is, I'm Against It, and the subtitle, Resistance to Change in Higher Education. So in this episode, we are coming to think about the state of higher education in America, and our guest is the author, Brian Rosenberg. Brian, welcome to Come to Think of It.
Pleasure to be with you.
So we were just joking before the show started of how you could give a one-sentence essay to people of how not to be a college professor. It's kind of brave to write a book where you basically say, I'm going to write a whole book, and the story of the book is we can't fix anything. So I credit you for doing that, but it's a terrific book. Let's start with you for a second, though, because you've been in education for your whole career, and most of which was the president of Macalester University. So what got you to think about writing the book, and what made you think you were the person to write this book?
You know, one of the things, first of all, again, thank you for having me. One of the things that's really puzzled me throughout my entire career, I spent 15 years as a faculty member and then 5 as a dean, and then, as you said, 17 years as president of Macalester. And higher education has been described as a deeply conservative industry populated by very progressive people. And it never quite made sense to me. You have all these people in higher education who talk about change in society, who talk about change in their professional disciplines, but when it comes to their own workplace, they don't want anything to change. And it's something that I've tried to figure out for a long time, and I came to the conclusion that it's not that people don't want to be good at their job. Most people want to be good at their job. And most people who work in higher education are well-meaning. So it's not about bad actors, it tends to be about cultures and structures that prevent change. And I thought, well, you know, I've been in this system for my whole professional life. I've been in a number of different roles. I've lived through a lot of it. And so if I'm willing to be honest, I'm in a pretty good position to talk about why it is that change is so hard in this industry that is supposed to be transformational. So I'm not sure if I was the right person to write it, but I did feel a kind of calling to write it at a certain point.
So before we talk about whether or not we can get change and some of the impediments to change, I'd like to actually start with the first chapter, and I have to take my glasses off to read a quote here. The first chapter is called The Case for Change, and you give an episode of something that happened at Macalester, and then you say, not only was there resistance to change, there was resistance to even talking about change. That's not an exact quote, I changed a few words, but that was the theme there. So let's get into chapter 1 and talk about the case for change to begin with, and then we can talk about change itself.
Sure. And, I wrote this book before Trump 2.0, so let's put that aside for a minute. Even before Trump was reelected, there were problems with our system of higher education that I thought were leading to an inevitable disruptive change in the system. And the main things that I would identify are, first of all, and you mentioned this, cost. It's too expensive. Right now, the average discount rate at a private college or university in the United States is approaching 60%. In other words, higher education is on sale for 60% off. If you walked into a store and you saw a sign that said 60% off everything, you would assume it was a closeout sale. And every year that discounting goes up higher and higher, and sooner or later it gets to 100%, you're giving it away for free. So the first problem is it's too expensive. People are unconvinced that it's worth it, and many people simply can't afford it. The second problem is demographic. We are headed in this country for what's been called a demographic cliff. We're an aging country. The average age in the United States right now is approaching 40 years old. And the number of high school graduates is declining sharply. And of course, that's the market for colleges and universities mostly. It's high school graduates. So if your market is shrinking, that's another serious problem. Even before the current presidential administration, public confidence in higher education was cratering. More among Republicans than Democrats, but even among Democrats. And then, of course, there's technology. Higher education is on the verge of being dramatically disrupted by technology, and particularly by artificial intelligence. So you put all that together, and you have an industry that hasn't changed dramatically in a long time, and I think you're looking at a radical shift. So I think that whether we had the current situation or not, things in higher education 10 years from now are not going to look the way they looked 10 years ago.
So you mentioned the financial aspects. You would think that people could at least focus on the financial crisis, if that's a fair word to use, and as you said, the discounting that occurs to have people be able to pay for college. Why is it that we can't even get our arms around the financial aspects, let alone some of the other problems we talked about?
The two main drivers of higher education cost are people and buildings. And buildings are hard to get rid of. College campuses are expensive to maintain. They're old. There's a lot of deferred maintenance. You can't sell them off very easily. And when it comes to people, the hardest thing for organizations to do, especially colleges and universities, is to do their job with fewer people. And so unless we can figure out a way to deliver a college education with fewer people, it's very, very hard to bend the cost curve. The industries that have done that have essentially done it through increasing efficiency. And the reality is that colleges and universities have not become more efficient for a very, very long time, if ever. And so unless you figure out ways to be more efficient, it's really, really hard to lower costs.
It's interesting that you mentioned the physical plant part of this. I've spent a lot of my career in healthcare, and it's the same problems with hospitals. If someone builds a hospital in a location, they add on to the hospital, they add on, but over time the demographics shift, maybe the needs for the community shifts, yet you have this physical plant, and you can't exactly pick up and go somewhere else. I've always given the example of, if someone owns a shoe store and the demographics shift, you can close down your lease, you move somewhere else, you open another shoe store. You can't do that with a school, and you certainly can't do that with a hospital. So, as you said, people don't even want to even talk about change, let alone get to change. How do you get them talking about some of these unique issues even before you can solve a problem?
You have to, as a leader, you have to be honest with people. You have to share information. You have to let people know the reality of the finances of an institution. The number of colleges and universities in the country that are operating with major structural deficits would astonish people. And yet, even on those campuses, most people who work there don't know it. So, in order to solve a problem, the first thing you have to do is acknowledge the problem. And higher education has not been very good at acknowledging the problem. It's been very good at denying it, but it hasn't been very good at acknowledging it. So, it begins with letting people on each campus know the system we have right now is not sustainable. But for a whole variety of reasons, colleges are very reluctant to do that. If colleges operate in a marketplace, and if word gets out that your college is in financial trouble, it can very easily become a death spiral. So people are more likely to conceal it than they are to talk honestly about it.
Again, I didn't think we were going to start making these healthcare comparisons, but again, in the world I used to deal in healthcare, and I mentioned hospitals, it's really the same scenario. You don't want word to get out that the hospital is in financial difficulties, and I'm willing to guess there's more hospitals in financial difficulties in the United States than actually educational institutions, because once that word gets out, the nurses leave, the doctors are going to leave, and sooner or later, you have buildings and you have nothing there. One of the things you mentioned in your book is the fact that the academic calendar doesn't really seem to make sense anymore, because you have these physical plants and they're only used, I don't know what percentage of the time, 2/3 of the time. Have you been able to get people to at least think about some of those issues to maybe not solve the problem, but tweak the problem?
There is a movement, it's small, to try to move to a 3-year degree by changing the calendar. I mean, the reality is that if you didn't have these long breaks over the summer and over the winter, you could include the same number of credits and the same number of courses in 3 years that you include in 4. And the easiest way to reduce the cost of a 4-year degree is make it a 3-year degree. There is a small group of schools that are experimenting with that. The accrediting agencies, which have been, I think, a real hindrance to change, are beginning to be open to the idea of 3-year degrees, of degrees that don't require 120 credits. And so I think schools are beginning to think about reducing the time to degree and changing the calendar. But it's moved very slowly. The first schools that tried it didn't have a lot of success. Students wanted to be there for 4 years. And so it's not an easy thing to change, but I do think cost is going to drive more students to be interested and parents to be interested in a shorter degree, and maybe more institutions to be interested. And that means the calendar is crazy. My wife, you talk about healthcare, my wife is a physician. She's a retired physician. She never quite understood why I had these long breaks. She didn't get those long breaks. Most people who work don't get those long breaks. But colleges and universities essentially shut down for, as you said, about 1/3 of the year. It really makes no economic or pedagogical sense.
And you mentioned a calendar. I hadn't thought about that before. And I'm guessing you will know the answer to this, and I'm just speculating. In some of my travels to Europe and Israel and other places, I have a sense that their college systems are not 4-year colleges. And if I'm correct about that, it would seem that in America we could look at other places around the world and see that it actually works there. So we don't have to invent it, we just have to copy it.
Exactly. No, the typical bachelor's degree in the UK is 3 years. I've been doing some work in Africa, and the university I've been working with in Africa has its bachelor's degree is 3 years. There's nothing sacrosanct about the 4-year degree. And so absolutely, it wouldn't be very difficult to create calendars that would compress the amount of time it required students to get from the beginning to the end.
And it's funny you said they want to stay in school for 4 years. My sense is kids are now staying in school for 5 years. I told my daughters, you can stay in school as long as you want. I'm just only paying for the first 4. So
Yeah,
That
no,
seems,
students, it was not uncommon when I was at Macalester for students who had completed enough credits after 3.5 years to stay for another semester anyway, because they wanted to stay with their friends, they were having a good time. And if their parents were willing to pay for it, then, they were in no rush.
so you start with the case for change, you focus on the economics, which, really are kind of scary if someone, wants to take the trouble to do a deep dive on your analysis of cost cutting and other things. It's like a death spiral, as you said. But now I want to jump ahead to the back of the book and the answer of why resistance to change in higher education. Seems to me it all comes down to pretty much your chapter on shared governance. And I'm going to read a quote again. Higher education has more third rails than a train yard. Of these, the one with the second highest voltage is shared governance. And then you point out that tenure is, of course, the first most dangerous third rail. And I want to really get into this chapter, but I was thinking of an old phrase, and I don't know how many of our listeners will know it, but I know you know. Harry Truman said, "The buck stops here." Seems to me when I read your chapter, when we're talking about higher education, the buck doesn't stop anywhere. So break down for us this notion of shared governance and pretty much why it doesn't work.
So shared governance was a creation of the middle of the 20th century in the United States. The key document that established the process of shared governance was written in 1966, and it was an agreement on the part of boards of trustees, presidents, and faculty that they would share decision making in higher education. It was very much the product of a particular moment in history. People referred to the period from the end of the Second World War until, probably the Great Recession as the golden age of American higher education. And by that they mean it was an age for the most part of expansion. You saw more colleges, you saw more students going to college. All of a sudden more and more women were going to college, much more diverse populations. And when you're trying to figure out how to manage a growing industry, it's easy to imagine that people will cooperate. But when you have an industry that is not growing but struggling, then people tend to retreat to their individual interests. But what shared governance did was basically divide up responsibilities in an institution. The Board of Trustees has responsibility for essentially financial oversight. The faculty has responsibility for the entire academic program. And the president is kind of in the middle, as the connecting point between the Board of Trustees and the faculty. But the process prioritizes participation over outcomes. And that never leads to good decision making. You rarely get consensus around difficult decisions because they're difficult. So if you're prioritizing consensus, what you're going to end up with is solutions that are the least objectionable to the largest number of people. And that's not going to result in much change or much strategy, and that's kind of what you have in higher education. I like the way you phrased it. The buck doesn't really stop anywhere.
Well, I want to dig a little deeper because you mentioned the faculty and the board, but there's really other layers. If we have public institutions, we've got the politicians who are going to be allocating finances for the budget. We've got the alumni who in most universities are critical because we're reaching out to alumni to make contributions and build up the charitable base that's needed to support the university. And at many, many schools, we have very active student populations with student governance, which I really don't understand. I've spent my career in politics. I get politics, but they have student governance where people are coming in for 5 and 10 seconds before they're leaving and letting them make decisions that can have lasting impact. I don't understand that at all. So you really got 5 or 6 different layers to deal with, and it doesn't seem as though anybody reports to anybody.
Yeah, so most colleges in the country are nonprofits, which is very different from a for-profit industry. In the for-profit industry, it's very clear who owns it, right? The shareholders. And if it's a private company, a family. With a nonprofit, it's owned by everybody and nobody. So technically there are no owners, but as you say, there's the board, there are alumni, there are faculty, there are staff, there are students, there are parents, there's the community around you, there are politicians. And each of those constituencies has its own priorities, and each of those constituencies is often divided within itself. It's very much, being the president of a college is very much like being the mayor of a small city. You know, a mayor doesn't have the ability to just snap his fingers and make things happen. He has to deal with a city council, with zoning boards, with unions. Being a college president is in a lot of ways very similar, which means that the most important skills tend to be political skills. It's not like being the CEO of a for-profit corporation.
I've taught myself a bit. I taught a couple years at Columbia, a class on advocacy at SEPA, and I taught at UCLA at the Luskin School. And I'm the kind of person that likes to solve problems. And it's not as though and I know better. I'm not going to go to either one of these institutions and try and solve problems. But I would ask a few questions, or how do I solve this problem, or how do I do this? And the answer I got a lot was essentially, they do it, or there's a them out there. This wasn't a pronoun conversation. This was, where do you go to solve a problem? And I'm dealing with people maybe in an academic office, and it seems as though most of the time there's a world of them somewhere out there that no one even understands, that not only to go and get a problem solved, but even how to attack it to bring up a problem. So have you faced this in your career, that there's this world of them out there that no one seems to be able to get their arms around?
I think the them phenomenon you described is a result of the fact that higher education is a very, very siloed industry. That is, these are often large organizations divided into an almost infinite number of parts. And it is very common for each part not to talk to the other part. You know, Macalester College had about 2,000 students. We had 35 different academic departments. And we probably had an equal number of administrative departments. And so when you have organizations that are so fragmented and so siloed, there's always an assumption that a problem is on someone else's desk, or responsibility lies elsewhere. And there's a tendency not to understand how the whole system, the whole institution works. So the reality is there's often not a them. There's just an assumption that there's someone out there solving a problem, but you don't know whether that's true or not, because you don't talk to those people. So I think it's a question of the way these institutions are organized. They're, you know, colleges and universities are, you know, think of the metaphor of a highway. Most people who study change will tell you that in order to change an organization, you need to have most people pulling in the same direction. Colleges and universities are not like highways where everybody's driving in the same direction. They're more like those bumper car rides at amusement parks, where everybody's driving in a different direction. And of course, what happens is nobody goes anywhere because you're bumping into each other. And that's kind of the way colleges and universities work. Everybody is going in their own direction with their own priorities, and the result is that nobody goes anywhere.
Yeah, I like your bumper car because another quote I love from your book, and one of the questions I think is a relevant question is, what really is a university, you know, in today's society? What is it there for? What does it accomplish, et cetera? And you talk about the definition of a series of individual faculty entrepreneurs held together by a common grievance over parking. And I will tell you that when I taught at UCLA, I was the low man on the totem pole, and I could never park my car. So that quote was just brilliant.
Yeah, well, I will tell you that I can't park my car at Harvard either. So.
Isn't that the only park the car in Harvard Yard?
Yeah.
So let's drill down a little further on what is a university, and because I don't know what it is anymore, but you talk about them, I'm going to quote you again here. Very few, if any, other industries are chopped into as many different, highly specialized pieces as higher education. Very few have so little interchangeable parts and so little organizational flexibility. Very few, as a result, are so agonizingly difficult to change. How did this happen?
It was, it's an interesting historical question. So if you look at the American higher education system through the middle of the 19th century, it was pretty clear what these institutions were. They were colleges. Harvard started out as Harvard College. And the job of these institutions was to provide intellectual and moral instruction at the time to young men, young white men. And so they were teaching, they were places where people taught. That began to change in the middle of the 19th century, and the reason it changed was that a number of American academics went to Europe and they went to Germany, and they discovered the German institution of the research university, where these universities were not just about teaching, they were also about doing research. And so they imported the German model of the research university to the United States. And so you began to see it at places like Harvard, Yale. They went from being teaching colleges to being these combinations of teaching and research. Then you mentioned healthcare, and I share the experience. I was on a large nonprofit healthcare board for 10 years in Minnesota, so I know a lot about that industry too. First university in the country to have a healthcare system was the University of Michigan. I believe it started in the 1880s, and they opened a hospital. And it's reasonable to ask, why in the world should universities be operating hospital systems? But they started to do it in the late 19th century. The other thing that started in the late 19th century was the early phases of big-time college sports. The United States is the only country in the world that has anything like big-time professional college sports associated with universities. You don't find that anywhere else. And so what eventually became the NCAA started in the early part of the 20th century. And so you went in a period of about 60 years from what were essentially teaching colleges to colleges or institutions that now taught and did major research and provided health care and provided what eventually became today professional sports. So think about what these institutions are now. It's very reasonable to be confused about what a university is because it's so many things. Think about where I am right now. Harvard University is not one thing. The largest source of revenue and expense at Harvard University is the hospital system. Harvard University is a healthcare system with a university attached. Harvard University has the largest number of intercollegiate athletic teams of any school in the country. It has a law school. It has a business school. It has a public policy school. It has a public health school. It has a divinity school. So these institutions have become these behemoths trying to do 10 or 15 different things. And my own view is when you try to do 15 different things, you're not going to do any of them as well as you should.
That's a good place to take a break because I want to get into this issue and I want to dissect it more. So let's take a quick break and we'll be right back and do some dissecting. Food Bank of the Rockies is the largest hunger relief organization in the Rocky Mountain region. Currently, they are responding to the highest levels of hunger they've seen in 10 years. Through their network of hunger relief partners, including those here in Aspen, and food distribution events, the food bank is committed to providing nutritious and familiar foods to individuals across the Western Slope. Here's an example of their great work.
When I saw the long line of cars, I thought there's such a need in the valley What it feels like when you don't have food is that you've let your family down. I'm Sherry Lee. I'm 62 years old and I live in Grand Junction, Colorado. We were homeless and they fed us. We're better off than we've ever been, thanks to the food bank of the Rockies.
Welcome back to Come to Think of It. We're in the middle of an interview with Brian Rosenberg and his great book. When we last dropped off, he was explaining to us the evolution of major universities, and we're going to jump right back into that. So, as you said, Harvard is kind of like a medical center with a school over here. and those weren't your words; those were my words. But I've seen that in other places, and I have a sense that the evolution you just described in an earlier segment of from teaching to research to sports to other things also helps distort the financial model. We've read a lot in the papers lately about all this federal funding coming in from research, and if you cut that off, how does it affect the rest of the university? We've heard a lot about these large endowments. So universities have definitely changed and grown. As you said, our university system here is really different than anywhere else in the world. I'm wondering, as we're going to go back to the financial stuff we talked about at the beginning, as we're facing the financial concerns, is there a time to look at some of these institutions and maybe break them up, like a corporate raider comes in and he sees a corporation that has all these subsidiaries and not necessarily in sync, as you said, with parts of the university, they do different things, and they come in and they figure out what can be fixed, what can be sold off, what has to be shut down. Do you think at some of these universities we have to take an approach like that, go back to square one and break the pieces apart and see what works and see what doesn't, and if nothing else, at some point get back to the goal of educating?
Yeah, and I think it's a good question and it's a good observation. I do think it's always hard to predict the future. And my definition of a future is there's someone who doesn't want you to read their book in 20 years because it's probably going to have been wrong. But I do think that one of the things you're going to see over the next couple of decades is more and more institutions becoming more narrowly focused on fewer things. Higher education in the United States has evolved essentially through institutions trying to emulate the wealthiest, most elite colleges and universities. The Ivy Leagues, the Stanfords, the Universities of Chicago's. Most institutions don't have the resources to do that. And as a result, they've created budget models that are unsustainable. They've become, as you said, very, very dependent upon federal funding. I mean, it's, the federal government giveth and the federal government taketh away. MIT, almost half the revenue at MIT comes from federal grants. Almost half. And so that is an extraordinary vulnerability. And what we're seeing now is what happens when that lifeline becomes an existential risk. And so I do think you're going to see more colleges and universities in particular, say, you know what? We can't afford to try to be like Harvard. We can't afford to try to be like Stanford. We're going to narrow our focus. We're going to narrow our mission. We're going to decide what we can do really well, what is more financially sustainable. Because we can't count on hundreds of millions of dollars from the federal government every year. Even after Trump, I don't think we're going to return to a time when the federal government is as large and stable a source of funding for colleges and universities as we've seen since the end of the Second World War. So I do think I think it would be actually smart for a lot of institutions to say, let's figure out how we can do fewer things and do those things really well and do those things in a way that is financially sustainable.
So we talked about this model of all these different layers of governance, and it doesn't really come together. And then we were just talking about how you might break things up and, or as you said, have a more focused approach at certain institutions, and specialization's a good buzzword. But at the same time, in your book, you talk about the fact that I think, or whether you talk about it as implied, it's one of my takeaways, that it's almost impossible to do any planning, strategic planning. And if you can't do strategic planning, you can't get to some of the results you have to get to. So do you see a way that schools can at least agree on strategic planning, or does it all have to come from the outside?
I don't think it needs to come to the outside if schools are willing to make the hard decisions about limiting the number of people who actually, at the end of the day, have decision-making power. That is, where does the buck stop? There have been studies of boards, corporate boards, and the studies suggest that the ideal size for a decision-making group is 7 or 8 people. And we've all experienced this in our lives. Get 7 or 8 people around the table, and you might actually come to some important and thoughtful decision. If 7 or 8 becomes 70 or 80, then that's much less likely to happen. And so I think college boards need to be smaller. And I think there can be lots of people who have input, who express their opinions. But I think the actual decision makers need to be a smaller, more carefully chosen group. And if universities are willing to do that, then I think there's some possibility that they can make some strategic decisions internally. If they don't do it, change is going to be forced on them from without, by economics, by government, by demographics. And from my perspective, it's always better to control your own fate than to have it forced upon you by circumstances beyond your control.
So you were the president of Macalester, had I believe, a 17-year run, and it sounds like you just had an amazing run. So I want to focus a little more on the role of the president, because it seems to me that to get to some of these places we've talked about, you can have all the systems in the world, but if you don't have leadership, and you don't have strength of leadership and strength of conviction, you can't get places. And sometimes if you can't get places, but you have strength of leadership, you can get places. So there's some discussions in your book, and again, I'd like to read some quotes here. And you say, presidents who enter determined against all odds to be change agents usually have very short half-lives. So how do we create a generation of presidents that won't have short half-lives?
It's becoming harder and harder. When I started at Macalester, the average presidential tenure was almost 10 years. Now the average presidential tenure is about 5 years, and it keeps getting shorter. And there are a lot of different reasons for that. You mentioned some of the things that have happened over the last decade or so that have created enormous stresses on universities and enormous pressures on presidents. I think social media has made it harder for presidents to last. When I was president, I started in 2003. If I screwed up, then the worst that would happen is someone would send me an email. Now, if someone doesn't like something that you do, they can go on social media and you can get 10,000 people to tell you that you're an idiot within 15 minutes. It's just the nature of the society that we live in now. We don't extend people a lot of grace. And we see that in pretty much every area of our society. And so it's hard. So I think in order for a president to last, the single most important factor is having a board that is supportive of you and is willing to stick with you through difficult times. At the end of the day, the president, I had 32 people on my board of trustees. I had 32 bosses. And one of the reasons that I was able to last 17 years is I was very lucky. I had very good boards. They were very supportive, they were very thoughtful, they were very engaged. And without that, I wouldn't have lasted. And a lot of the presidents I know who don't last don't have those boards who have their backs. So boards have to understand that presidents are going to be criticized. The more difficult the decisions they have to make, the more likely it is that they are going to be criticized. And you need to have their backs. And unfortunately, we don't always see that is the case. It is particularly tough for presidents at public institutions, where the boards are highly politicized. And it's they're making decisions not just on the basis of what's best for the university, but on the basis of political affiliation. And that usually doesn't work out very well. Look what just happened at the University of Florida. You had a president come in who was an experienced president of the University of Michigan, unanimous recommendation from the university's board, and then rejected by the state board of education, and now they have no president. When you have that kind of politicizing of a leadership position, it's really hard to get people to take those jobs, and it's really hard to get them to stay.
That's the other side of it, of course. You have to have a job that someone wants to take, because certainly you could take a job, maybe it pays really, really well and you want to make some money for a few years, but if you actually want to get something done, why would you want to waste 2 or 3 years of your life getting nothing done just to make a couple bucks? And it might be at the prime of your life. And I would think these people who are qualified to be presidents of universities could be qualified to do many other things. So it has to be a job, at least would be for me, where I could see that I could come in and solve problems. You do talk about a few presidents in your book who seem to have been able to overcome some of this. And one in particular, Michael Crow at Arizona State. And you say about him, a different and more divisive kind of transformational leader, one who pretty much ignores processes like shared governance, imports a corporate model into an academic context, and imposes his will on the institution. I don't know Mr. Crow at all, but I do know a little bit about Arizona State and some of the innovations occurring there. How could he come in and do this? And are there more Michael Crows out there like that who could go to the right place and do some of this? That's the first part of the question. The second part is, if that starts happening, will that start opening doors and allow us to solve more problems?
So, obviously, I do not know Michael Crow well, but obviously he's a person with a particular set of characteristics that allowed him to do that. But he was also placed in a situation that created those possibilities. He came to a university, Arizona State, at a time when its reputation was very low. Arizona State was basically perceived as a second-rate party school. And so it was ripe for change. It had a very weak governance system. He was in a state with a growing population, and he had a very supportive state government. And so he had a certain set of qualities, but he also had the right environment that would allow those qualities to manifest themselves. If you had and I think I say this in the book, if you had taken Michael Crow and put him into an Ivy League institution, there's no way that he would have been able to be as transformational as he was at Arizona State. In terms of emulation, I do think institutions are looking at places like Arizona State and trying to figure out how they have managed to be so transformational and to grow and to be so financially successful. You have another example at Southern New Hampshire University. Southern New Hampshire University 20 years ago was a little in-person campus in the middle of nowhere. It now enrolls 250,000 students, 250,000 students, mostly online, and they had another they had Paul LeBlanc. He was the Michael Crow of Southern New Hampshire, who had a vision for a very different kind of education that was less expensive, that focused on more non-traditional older students who couldn't afford to come and live on a college campus, and he's managed to create an educational behemoth. So there are examples of, if you take the right person and the right set of circumstances, there are examples of places that have managed to transform themselves. And I think other institutions are looking at those models and thinking, is there some way for us to learn something from that?
It's funny you mentioned Southern New Hampshire University. I'll do a quick aside with you here. So when my oldest daughter was looking at schools, that's one of the schools we looked at. And we went there, and I got a hat. So I think it says SNHU. And I'm wearing this SNHU hat. And no one knows what it is. And I would make people guess, what could this be? About 1 out of every 50 people would guess Southern New Hampshire University. And I lost the hat. I love that hat. One of the things that I think has been lost at schools, and I regret, and I think it's there, is, I don't know what the right word is, maybe taking responsibility, taking risk, and those aren't always the same things. It seems to me houses of education, institutions of education, that should be where people take risks. That should be where when you grow to learn, you go to try things, you go to maybe invent something, you take different classes, you fail, you learn from failing, but you also take responsibility for that failure. I think a lot of that's been lost. Am I right or wrong about that? And if I'm right about it, how do we at least get that part back?
Yeah, one of the things to remember about universities, colleges, and universities is they don't exist in a vacuum. And they are in many ways reflections of other things happening in society. And when you think about the way our society in this country has evolved over the last 2-3 decades, we have become much more fearful. We've become much more risk averse. We have raised a generation of young people who are much more fragile and much more worried. And, I'm not sure that's on them. I think, and I look at myself in the mirror when I talk about this because, I have 2 sons. Have we really done the right thing for our children by being so protective? We talk at colleges and universities about helicopter parents. My former dean of students described them as snowplow parents. They would just get in the way and plow all the snow, all the blockages away from their kids so they didn't have anything that they had to, any problems they had to solve for themselves. So I think unfortunately, we've raised a generation that is much more fragile than prior generations and therefore much more unwilling to take risks. And I agree with you. College should be a place where you take risks. College should be a place where your views are challenged and questioned. College should be a place where you are uncomfortable. Because when you come into contact with people unlike you, with views unlike your own, it's uncomfortable. But that's how you learn. You don't learn from being surrounded by people who think just like you. You learn from people who don't think like you. And even if it doesn't change your viewpoint, it makes your viewpoint sharper and better. And I do think we have lost a lot of that in higher education because we've become so protective and so focused on not making students uncomfortable. And I think we need to get back to an acceptance of the fact that, look, if you're going to learn, there are going to be times when it's uncomfortable. And that's not necessarily a bad or a wrong thing.
Yeah, and I certainly hope we can get back there. So you were mentioning University of Florida, and I want to read something to you. It was in the Wall Street Journal. I'm guessing you saw it from Ben Sass, who had been at the University of Florida. And it was in the Wall Street Journal, and it caught my eye because I knew we were going to be doing this interview. And I'll read this if it's okay. It said, 3 outcomes are possible in Donald Trump's war with Harvard. Scenario 1 is that the nation's top private universities remain delusional about the dozen reasons a large and growing share of the public distrusts them. The plan is to avoid institutional course correction and seek protection from the courts and ultimate rescue from the Democratic Party in 2029 or after. Course 1. Scenario 2 is that Trump and other populist-inspired politicians force change from without by intervening more consistently and even more forcefully in the internal operations of these schools. Scenario 3 is that substantive reform comes from within these schools, or at least some of them. And it goes on. Mr. Sass basically says he wants number 3 to win. He wants these institutions to learn how to reform from within. And in your book, for many reasons that I said this could be the shortest interview on record, basically points out that it's almost impossible to change the system. Now, people have many opinions about Trump, and just so you know, my politics, I have an equal disdain for both parties. I think they're both inept. So I have opinions about Trump, but I have opinions about a lot of things. But Trump is a disruptor, and I'm wondering if Trump the disruptor, Trump the person that wants to pull the financing, Trump the person that wants to rejigger things and come in and do things, and some people would call that bullying, can that be the one thing that ultimately causes Brian Rosenberg to decide schools will find the ability to change because the risk otherwise is too great to take?
So I'll try to stay away from my own political views. Simply say I'm not. When it comes to Donald Trump, I'm not a fan. I think that shocks to the system can produce change, and I do think that Trump and what the federal government right now is doing is certainly a shock to the system. I don't think that the outcome of having the federal government make decisions for colleges and universities is a desirable one. I think that's what you tend to find in non-democratic societies, where you don't have independent universities, and so I would agree, that of those three choices, the most desirable one is that change comes from within, reform comes from within. I also will say I don't agree with Ben with some of the diagnoses that Ben says has about higher education. It's got lots of flaws, and it's got lots of problems. But I don't think that some of the things that it is being accused of by politicians right now are necessarily accurate or true.
Well, I think our system of higher education is the greatest in the world. I think it is an amazing asset for our country. I hope we can find the people and the processes to get this right, and I think your book is a really good start. I don't normally do what some people do, where they have a bit of a lightning round, they called it, and sometimes they want one-word answers. But I do have a couple of lightning round type questions I want to run past you, just totally off the cuff, and see how you react to them. I'm wondering if perhaps one of the big changes that has to happen in our educational system is that our community college system, and I don't know if that's unique to the world either, but it's a growing system, and I think it serves a very, very valuable purpose. I'm wondering if every student coming out of high school should be required to next go to community college, and then they go to whatever we call it after that. It wouldn't be a four-year college, higher education, whatever it is. Should we create an interim place for people to go before they land at this higher level of higher education?
So my ideal would be every student is forced to take a gap year of public service. So not necessarily community college, but a year in which they perform some important public service, and it would give them a little bit more maturity before they moved into higher education. It would give them more of a sense of social responsibility. It would allow them to understand more fully the way a democracy works, and it would potentially serve important needs for the country. So, I would love to see a higher education system where, it doesn't even have to be the first year. Imagine if college were 5 years, but 1 year were a required year of public service. I think that could be very, very valuable, really, really interesting.
And I'm totally on board with that. I've done some writing of my own. I've written a lot about that, so we're totally in agreement on that. We didn't talk about tenure on the show. Tenure is a whole other conversation. As you said, it's of all the third rails in education, it's the one that has the most electricity associated with it. But I do want to ask you maybe one quick tenure question and maybe put you on the spot on tenure a bit. Would it help if people could still have tenure, but it wasn't forever tenure? So in other words, it always had either a 10 or 20 year or some end period where there had to be some reevaluation. I don't know if that works or not. And if that doesn't work, do you have some quick fixes for tenure that we could take on?
So we have to blame Congress for the current part of the current mess. Up until the early part of the 1990s, colleges and universities were exempt from the Age Discrimination Act, so you could have required retirement ages. And then I think it was 1994, Congress did away with that. And so now tenure is essentially forever. I do think there are alternatives to tenure that make a lot more sense. Long-term contracts. How many people in the American workforce have something like a 20-year contract? Almost nobody. And so there are all kinds of systems where you could provide economic guarantees, you could provide the guarantee of academic freedom, but it doesn't come with a guarantee of lifetime employment. I don't think lifetime employment is a good idea for anybody, including federal judges. So I think there are alternatives that can preserve a lot of the good things that we might associate with tenure and get rid of some of the bad things.
I think some of the negative publicity around higher education over the years has evolved around the admissions process. And certainly there's been a lot of cases on that. And then we've had the recent Supreme Court decision about using affirmative action. And it seems as though the number of cases is endless. I have my own theory of how we could solve this problem. I don't know if I'm right or wrong. I'm going to run it past you. So every institution has their set of criteria, whatever that legitimate set of criteria is. And let's say the freshman class is going to have 1,000 students. The school, or each school rather, gets all the applications in, screens all the applications, and then they pick, let's say, the 2,000 students that would be qualified for the 1,000 slots. It then goes to a lottery. So 2,000 students are screened and selected for 1,000 slots, but from that point on, it's a pure lottery, and the 1,000 students that get in are from the base of 2,000, but the final decision is a pure lottery. Can that work?
So that's an idea that Michael Sandel at Harvard has been advocating for. At a
I
place
apologize,
like
Michael.
Harvard.
I didn't steal your idea, and you got there first. Take all the credit.
Now, so first of all, it's really important to remember that the vast majority of colleges and universities in the country are not selective. So basically, almost everybody gets in. So we're really only talking about a relatively small group of highly selective institutions. And that's where something like a lottery is at least something that could be talked about. The challenge with that is that you have a lot of needs that you're trying to meet, at least given the current educational system when you put together a class. And it's not just the athletes. You want students who can be in the orchestra, you want students who could be in the choir, you want students with different academic interests. And it would be harder to achieve all those goals with a lottery. But for a place like Harvard or Stanford, where Harvard or Stanford could fill their classes 10 times over with students with perfect SATs, there's a lot to recommend a lottery. I don't think it's necessarily a bad idea. But just remember that 95% of colleges, their problem is not lottery. Their problem is how in the world do we fill our classes?
I'm sorry, what's the problem? How do
we fill our classes? We don't have enough students to fill our classes and meet our tuition goals.
Yeah, tough stuff. Well, I want to thank you for being a terrific guest. I want to thank you for writing a great book. I highly recommend it to anyone that's in this area. We didn't talk about any specific issues today, and there's many specific issues that could be talked about, but I think I decided we had to start this conversation at the 10,000 foot level or the 100,000 foot level, because until you read a book like Brian's book, I don't think you can actually drill down and start talking about specific solutions. So Brian, thank you for your book, thank you for your work, and thank you for being a guest today.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for joining us today. We're going to hopefully have more about this conversation about the university system. It is a great asset for our country. It's one of our greatest assets. We have to preserve it, we have to make it better, and we've got to solve some of these problems. Thank you, and join us again on Come to Think of It.